Have you ever wondered how far a father can go when he sees his child being destroyed before his eyes? Well, I discovered that answer in a way I never imagined possible. If you want to know how simple white powder can transform into the most terrible weapon that ever existed, subscribe to the channel, share this video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this story will completely change your perspective on justice and revenge. My name is Elijah, and in 1859 I was just another slave at Oak Ridge Plantation in the suffocating heart of Georgia. But let me tell you how it all began on that cursed September night. The air was heavy as molasses when the dinner bell rang. I was finishing my work at the tannery, my hands still stained with the quicklime we used to treat the hides. The acrid smell of the chemical clung to my skin like second nature. After 15 years working with that white powder, I knew every property of it better than any university chemist. "Elijah, bring the boy to serve at the big house." The harsh voice of Overseer Jenkins echoed across the yard. My heart tightened. Samuel, my 12-year-old son, had been helping in the kitchen since he turned 10. He was a smart boy, with bright eyes that reminded me of his mother, who died giving birth to his younger sister. I found Samuel in the kitchen, nervous as he always got when he had to serve the white folks. His small hands trembled as he held the silver tray with the bottle of Kentucky bourbon that Master Whitmore so appreciated. "Father, I'm scared," he whispered, his brown eyes pleading for protection I knew I couldn't offer. "Just keep your head down and do exactly what they tell you," I replied, my voice steadier than my heart. "Everything will be fine." How wrong I was. The dining room of the big house was a spectacle of obscene opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, reflecting golden light over the polished mahogany table. Master Whitmore sat at the head, his graying beard well trimmed, discussing business with two visitors from Savannah. But it was Silas Cobb who made my blood freeze. Silas was the head overseer, a man in his 40s with scars on his hands and eyes that looked like cold stones. He had a reputation that spread across 3 counties. They said he could break a man without even touching him, just with words and the whip he always carried at his waist. That whip had a sinister peculiarity. Silas would soak it in lye before using it, so the cuts would burn like hellfire. Samuel entered the room with cautious steps, the tray perfectly balanced in his small hands. I watched him from the kitchen door, my heart beating like a war drum. Everything was going well until Samuel approached Silas. The overseer was telling a vulgar story about a slave from a neighboring plantation, gesticulating violently with his hands. At the exact moment Samuel leaned forward to serve the bourbon, Silas made a sudden movement with his right arm. The impact was inevitable. Silas's arm hit the tray, and the bourbon bottle flew through the air, spilling the amber liquid over the overseer's immaculate white shirt. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see terror spreading across Samuel's face like ink in water. "You damn animal!" Silas roared, rising from his chair with a fury that made the other men step back. "Look what you've done, you beast!" "It was an accident, sir," Samuel stammered, his words tumbling over each other. "Please, I didn't mean to—" "Accident?" Silas laughed, but there was no humor in that sound. It was the laugh of a predator who had just found its prey. "I'll teach you about accidents, boy." Before I could react, Silas was already unsheathing his whip. The black leather gleamed under the chandelier light, and I could see drops of lye still wet on the tip. My body moved by instinct, but 2 overseers grabbed my arms before I could take a step. "Father!" Samuel screamed, his eyes desperately searching for me. The first blow cut through the air with a deadly whistle. Samuel tried to dodge, but the whip struck him in the face with cruel precision. The sound was like a branch breaking, followed by the most painful scream I'd ever heard in my life. But it wasn't just the cut that destroyed me. It was what happened after. The lye on the whip began reacting immediately with the moisture in Samuel's eyes. I knew that chemical reaction better than any man alive. It was the same one we used in the tannery to dissolve fat from hides. But in a child's eyes, Samuel fell to the floor, his hands covering his face, screaming an agony that echoed through the walls of the big house like the lament of 1,000 lost souls. Blood and tears mixed between his fingers, and I knew, with the terrible certainty of someone who understood chemistry, that my son would never see daylight again. "Silas," Master Whitmore finally reacted, but his voice carried more irritation than horror. "You've stained my Persian rug." In that moment, something died inside me. It wasn't just hope or love. It was something deeper. It was my humanity. As I carried Samuel out of the big house, his screams of pain echoing in my ears, a deadly coldness took hold of my chest. I spent the entire night caring for my son, applying cold compresses to his destroyed eyes, knowing it was useless. The lie had completely burned his corneas. Samuel was blind forever, and all because of an accident that wasn't even his fault. But as I held my son in my arms, watching him fight against the pain, an idea began to form in my mind. A terrible and brilliant idea at the same time. I knew quicklime better than any man in Georgia. I knew how it reacted with moisture, how it burned, how it destroyed, and suddenly I realized that the tool of my slavery could become the weapon of my revenge. Silas Cobb had blinded my son with chemistry. It was only fair that I return the favor. That night, while Samuel finally fell asleep exhausted by pain, I began to plan. 19 overseers worked at Oak Ridge Plantation, 19 men who had laughed while my son screamed in agony. In 48 hours, they would all know darkness. Can you imagine what it's like to discover that the tool of your suffering can become the key to your revenge? While I cared for my son's destroyed eyes, a terrible revelation began to take shape in my mind. If you want to understand how simple white powder can transform into the most silent and lethal weapon that ever existed, keep watching, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what was the most creative revenge you've ever seen in your life? Dawn came gray and heavy over Oak Ridge. Samuel had spent the entire night moaning in pain, and I hadn't been able to sleep a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Silas's whip cutting through the air, saw the lie burning my boy's corneas. But I also saw something more, an opportunity that had been right under my nose for 15 years. At 5 in the morning, the bell rang for work. I left Samuel in the care of Martha, an older slave who looked after the children, and headed to the tannery with heavy steps. But my mind was sharper than a razor. The Oak Ridge Plantation Tannery was one of the largest in Georgia. We processed hides from cattle, pigs, and even some deer that the masters hunted. The process was complex and required chemical knowledge that few slaves possessed. That's why I was too valuable to be sold or killed. I knew every secret of that place. I entered the main shed, where enormous wooden tanks contained the chemical solutions. The familiar smell of quicklime hit me like a slap, but this time, instead of resignation, I felt a dark excitement. Quicklime, calcium oxide, a seemingly harmless white powder that transformed into calcium hydroxide when it came into contact with water. The reaction was violent, releasing enough heat to burn flesh and destroy organic tissues. In the tannery, we used this property to remove hair and fat from hides, but I knew its applications could be much more creative. I began my routine work, but my mind was calculating. I needed pure quicklime, finely ground. I needed a way to apply it without leaving traces. And I needed a plan that would allow me to hit all 19 overseers without being discovered. Elijah! Jenkins' harsh voice pulled me from my thoughts. The secondary overseer was approaching, his sweaty face gleaming under the morning sun. Master Whitmore wants you to prepare a special batch of leather for the visitors from Savannah. They want to see our process. Yes, sir, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. But inside, my heart accelerated. A demonstration meant unrestricted access to chemical materials. I spent the morning preparing the demonstration, but every movement was calculated. While grinding quicklime for the tanning process, I discreetly separated a portion of the finest powder. It was so subtle it looked like common dust, but I knew each grain was a small chemical bomb waiting to explode. During lunch, I returned to the slave quarters to check on Samuel. My son was awake, but his eyes, or what remained of them, were covered with improvised bandages. When he heard my footsteps, he turned his head in my direction. Father, is that you? Yes, son. My voice almost failed. Seeing that brilliant boy reduced to this condition filled me with such pure rage that for a moment I thought my chest would explode. Father, I can't see anything. Everything is dark. His words were a broken whisper. Will it come back? Will my sight come back? I could have lied, should have lied, but I looked at that innocent face, at the bloodied bandages, and the truth came out like a confession. No, Samuel, it won't come back. The silence that followed was more painful than any whipping, but then Samuel did something that surprised me. He extended his small hand and found mine. "Father, I know you're going to do something. I know you won't let this pass." The wisdom of those words coming from a 12-year-old child hit me like lightning. My son knew me better than I knew myself. He knew the storm was forming inside me. "Rest now," I said, kissing his forehead. "Everything will be fine." I returned to the tannery with iron determination. The demonstration for the Savannah visitors would be my perfect opportunity. While explaining the tanning process, I observed every overseer present. Silas was there, of course, with that cruel smile that made me want to tear out his throat, but I had a better plan. "Quicklime," I explained to the visitors, holding a handful of the white powder, "is the heart of our process. When mixed with water, it creates an exothermic reaction that dissolves proteins and fats." One of the visitors, a fat man with golden glasses, leaned forward with interest. "And is it safe to handle?" "Completely safe when dry," I lied, with an ease that surprised me. "The danger only exists when it comes into contact with moisture." Silas laughed loudly. "Elijah here is our chemistry expert. 15 years messing with this crap, isn't that right, boy?" "Yes, sir," I replied, but my eyes were calculating the distance between us, imagining what it would be like to see that arrogant face contorting in agony. After the demonstration, I got what I needed. 3 pounds of pure quicklime ground to a powder fine as talc. I hid the material in small leather pouches that I discreetly crafted, distributing them in strategic hiding places throughout the plantation. As the sun set over Oak Ridge, painting the sky blood red, I finalized my preparations. I had studied the overseers' sleep patterns, mapped their nightly routes, identified the vulnerable points of each lodging. Quicklime had a particular property that made it perfect for my plan. When finely pulverized and blown into the eyes, it reacted instantly with tears and natural moisture, causing irreversible chemical burns. The process was silent, quick, and left little physical evidence. That night, as the plantation plunged into silence, I prepared to become something I never thought I would be: a ghost of vengeance, armed with nothing but chemical knowledge and a thirst for justice that burned hotter than any quicklime. 19 men had laughed while my son screamed. 19 men would sleep peacefully that night, not knowing it would be the last time they would see the stars. The first night of terror was about to begin. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to move through the shadows like a ghost, carrying silent death in your hands? This night, I would become something I never thought possible: an angel of vengeance, armed only with white powder and chemical knowledge. If you want to discover how I transformed the plantation into a horror scene using only science, keep watching, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, do you believe revenge can be justified? Midnight. The moon was hidden behind heavy clouds, creating the perfect darkness for what I had planned. I had spent the last few hours observing, waiting, calculating every movement. The Oak Ridge overseers followed a predictable routine. They drank late, slept heavily, and only woke with the 5 o'clock bell. Perfect for my purpose. I left the slave quarters like a shadow, carrying 3 small leather pouches filled with finely ground quicklime. My heart was beating hard, but my mind was cold as ice. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. I had transformed into something new, a silent predator driven by a father's pain. My first target would be the minor overseer's lodging, a wooden construction at the back of the property. 8 men slept there, including Jenkins and Morrison, 2 of those who had held my arms while Silas destroyed my son. The construction was simple: 4 small rooms, 2 men per room, windows without glass protected only by coarse cotton curtains. I knew every board of that structure. I had helped build it 3 years before. I approached the first window. Through the curtain, I could hear the heavy breathing of Jenkins and his roommate, a young overseer named Tucker. The smell of cheap whiskey emanated from the room like a nauseating perfume. I carefully opened the first quicklime pouch. The powder was so fine, it looked like white smoke between my fingers. I separated a small amount in my palm and prepared for what would come next. The technique was simple but required precision. I needed to blow the powder directly into the sleeping men's eyes, ensuring the quicklime made immediate contact with the natural moisture of the eyes. The reaction would be instantaneous and irreversible. I gently pulled back the curtain and peered inside. Jenkins was lying on his back, mouth open, snoring like a pig. Tucker was on his side, face turned toward the window. Perfect. I took a deep breath and blew. The powder flew through the air like a ghostly mist, landing directly in Tucker's open eyes. The reaction was immediate. He woke with a start, hands flying to his face, but it was already too late. The quicklime was reacting with his tears, creating calcium hydroxide, a highly caustic substance that was literally dissolving his corneas. Tucker tried to scream, but I had already moved to Jenkins. Another blow, another target hit. Jenkins woke in silent agony, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. The pain was so intense it had stolen his voice. 2 down, 17 to go. I moved to the next room. Carter and Williams slept deeply, still wearing their dirty clothes from the previous day. The smell of sweat and alcohol was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to continue the same process. Precise blow, instantaneous chemical reaction, silent agony. Carter woke first, his hands clawing at his own face in desperation. Williams followed seconds later, rolling off the bed and hitting the floor with a dull thud. 4 men blind. The sound of their muffled moans began to echo through the lodging, but it still wasn't loud enough to wake the others. In the third room I found Davis and Thompson. Davis was a particularly cruel man. I had seen him whip slaves for pleasure, not discipline. Seeing his face contort in pain while the quicklime burned his eyes gave me a dark satisfaction I never thought I was capable of feeling. Thompson tried to get up when the pain hit him, but stumbled and fell, knocking over a chair. The noise echoed through the lodging, and I knew I had little time before someone investigated. 6 men blind, 2 remaining in this lodging. The last room housed Brooks and Hamilton. Brooks was the youngest of the overseers, only 20 years old, but had already developed the characteristic cruelty of his position. Hamilton was a veteran, with scars on his hands that told stories of violence. When I approached the window, Hamilton was moving restlessly as if some primitive instinct was alerting him to danger. I had to wait several minutes until he calmed down again. Finally, I managed to hit both. Brooks woke screaming, the first loud sound of the night, but Hamilton remained strangely silent, just writhing in bed as if having a nightmare. 8 men blind in less than an hour. As I moved away from the lodging, I could hear chaos beginning to set in. Moans of pain, stumbling footsteps, the sound of furniture being knocked over by men trying to navigate sudden and permanent darkness. But my work was just beginning. My next target was riskier, the senior overseer's house, a larger and better guarded construction where Silas's trusted men slept. 5 overseers, including Morrison and the feared Blackwood, a man who had killed 3 slaves with his own hands. The house was closer to the main residence, which meant greater risk of detection, but it also meant I was closer to Silas. I approached with even more care, using the shadows of trees to hide. The house had 2 entrances, one front and one back, that led to the kitchen. I chose the back one. The first window revealed Morrison and his companion, an overseer named Reed. Morrison was lying face down, which would complicate my task. I had to wait almost 15 minutes until he turned naturally during sleep. When I finally managed to hit him, Morrison woke with a violence that scared me. He rose from the bed like a wounded bull, hands clawing at his eyes, blood running between his fingers. Reed woke with the commotion, only to receive his own dose of quicklime. Morrison's screams echoed through the night, and I knew I had lost the element of surprise. Lights began to come on in the main house. Confused voices shouted contradictory orders, but I couldn't stop now. I ran to the next window, where Blackwood slept alone in a larger room. The man was a giant, over 6 feet tall with muscles that seemed carved from stone, but even giants need to sleep. I blew the quicklime into his eyes with surgical precision. Blackwood woke roaring like a wounded animal, his enormous fists punching the air blindly. For a terrible moment I thought he might see me through the window, but then I realized he was just thrashing in panic. 11 men blind, 8 remaining. But now the entire plantation was waking up. I could hear Silas shouting orders from the main house porch, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. Dogs began to bark. Lanterns lit up everywhere. I had to retreat to the shadows, my heart beating like a war drum. The first phase of my plan was complete, but the second would be even more dangerous. As I hid behind the stable, watching the chaos I had created, a cold satisfaction took hold of me. 11 men who had laughed at my son's agony now knew that same agony. But I still wasn't finished. 8 overseers remained, including Silas himself. The second night would be even more terrible. Can you imagine the terror that takes hold of a plantation when 11 men wake up blind simultaneously with no logical explanation? The chaos that settled over Oak Ridge that dawn was beyond any nightmare I could have imagined. If you want to understand how fear can transform powerful men into frightened children, keep watching, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what was the most terrifying situation you've ever witnessed? Dawn arrived tinged with red over Oak Ridge, but it wasn't just the sun painting the sky that color. It was the reflection of the hell I had unleashed during the night. I was hidden in the hay barn, watching through a crack in the wood as chaos unfolded before my eyes. 11 overseers stumbled through the yard like lost ghosts, hands extended in front of them, trying to navigate a world that had become completely dark for them. The sound was what impressed me most. Moans of pain mixed with screams of confusion. Jenkins was kneeling in the middle of the yard, hands covering his face, rocking back and forth like a traumatized child. Morrison had found a wall and was leaning against it, blood dripping between his fingers as he muttered desperate prayers. But it was Blackwood who gave me the greatest satisfaction. The giant who had terrorized slaves for years now crawled across the ground like a wounded animal, his enormous fists pounding the earth in helpless frustration. What the hell is happening here? Silas Cobb's voice cut through the morning air like a whip. The head overseer had emerged from the big house, still wearing only pants and an open shirt, his eyes still functional, sweeping the scene with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Master Whitmore appeared on the porch, his pale face contrasting with his burgundy silk robe. Beside him, the 2 visitors from Savannah observed the scene with barely disguised horror. "Silas," Whitmore shouted, "what kind of circus is this? Explain to me immediately." Silas approached Jenkins, the nearest overseer. "Jenkins, what happened to you?" Jenkins raised his head, and even from a distance, I could see that his eyes were just 2 red and swollen cavities. "I can't see, Mr. Silas. I can't see anything. I woke up and everything was dark and it hurts. God in heaven, how it hurts." "All of them are like this," said Tucker, his voice broken by pain. "All of us. We woke up blind." A deadly silence fell over the yard. I could see Silas processing the information, his mind trying to find a logical explanation for the impossible. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his voice carried an uncertainty I had never heard before. 11 men don't go blind overnight. It must be some kind of disease, some plague. Dr. Pemberton, the plantation doctor, came running with his black bag. He was a thin, nervous man who treated both whites and slaves, though with drastically different methods. He knelt beside Carter and forced his eyelids open. What he saw made him recoil with a muffled scream. "My God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The corneas are completely destroyed. It's as if they were burned by acid." "Acid?" Silas approached quickly. "What kind of acid?" "I don't know." Dr. Pemberton shook his head, examining another man. "But whatever it was applied directly to the eyes. The destruction is very specific, very precise." That's when I saw something that filled me with dark satisfaction. Fear, real fear in Silas Cobb's eyes. For the first time in his miserable life, he was facing something he couldn't whip, couldn't intimidate, couldn't control. "Master Whitmore," one of the Savannah visitors approached nervously. "Perhaps we should postpone our business. This situation is disturbing." "No." Whitmore descended the porch stairs, his authority wavering. "This is just an isolated incident. Silas will resolve it." But Silas was clearly lost. He paced back and forth, observing his destroyed men, trying to find a pattern, an explanation. "Gather all the slaves in the yard," he finally ordered. "Now." The bell rang, and within minutes, all the Oak Ridge slaves were assembled. I discreetly mixed into the group, keeping my expression neutral while watching Silas try to regain control of the situation. "Does anyone here know anything about what happened to my men?" Silas shouted, his voice echoing through the yard. "Did anyone see anything suspicious during the night?" Absolute silence. The slaves kept their eyes down, but I could feel a different tension in the air. It wasn't just fear. There was something more. Hope? Satisfaction? It was hard to tell. "Witchcraft," whispered an old voice. It was Mama Celia, the plantation's oldest slave, a woman who had seen 3 generations of Whitmores. "This is the work of witchcraft." "Shut up, old woman." Silas turned to her, but his voice carried more desperation than authority. "There's no such thing as witchcraft. This was done by someone, and I'm going to find out who." Dr. Pemberton approached Silas, his face pale. "Mr. Cobb, I need to speak with you privately." They moved a few meters away, but I could hear fragments of the conversation. "Chemical burns, highly caustic substance, applied with surgical precision." "Are you saying someone did this on purpose?" Silas's voice was rising in pitch. "I'm saying this wasn't an accident or disease. Someone with chemical knowledge did this deliberately." My heart accelerated. Dr. Pemberton was smarter than I had calculated, but even if he suspected the truth, he still needed to prove it. Silas returned to the group of slaves, his eyes scanning each face with predatory intensity. "Does anyone here work with chemicals?" Several slaves pointed to me. It was inevitable. Everyone knew I was the plantation's tannery specialist. "Elijah," Silas approached, and I could feel his hot breath on my face. "Where were you last night?" "In the slave quarters, sir," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Taking care of my son." "Your son?" For a moment, something passed through Silas's eyes. It wasn't remorse. Men like him were incapable of remorse. But it was recognition. "How is he?" "Blind, sir. Forever." The words hung in the air like a silent accusation. I could see Silas processing the connection, but he couldn't prove anything. Not yet. "Search the lodgings," he ordered the remaining overseers. "Look for anything suspicious, chemicals, powders, anything that could have been used." My heart froze. I had hidden my materials well, but a thorough search could reveal evidence. I needed to act fast. "Mr. Silas," Dr. Pemberton approached again, "I recommend we transfer the injured men to the infirmary. They need immediate medical care." "Do it," Silas agreed, but his eyes remained fixed on me. "And double the guard tonight. If someone is doing this, they'll try again." As the slaves were dismissed, I slowly moved away, my mind already planning the second phase. Silas was right about one thing. I would try again. But this time, it would be even bolder. 8 overseers remained, including Silas himself, and I had learned something valuable watching the morning's chaos. Fear was as powerful a weapon as quicklime. That night, I wouldn't just be a ghost of vengeance. I would be the nightmare that would transform Oak Ridge into hell on earth. The second night would be the last for many of them. Have you ever seen how fear can transform predators into prey? On this second night, I would no longer be just a shadow. I would be terror personified, using the overseer's own panic against them. If you want to discover how I transformed a barn into a deadly gas chamber, using only chemical knowledge and my enemy's arrogance, keep watching, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, how far would you go to protect your family? The second night arrived heavy with tension. Throughout the day, I watched Silas and his remaining men preparing for what they imagined would come. Guards were doubled, lanterns were distributed, and the 8 overseers who could still see gathered in the main barn to spend the night together, a decision that would seal all their fates. I had spent the day refining my plan. The remaining quicklime would be enough for one final assault, but this time I would need to be more creative. 8 alert and armed men in a closed space represented a completely different challenge from the sleeping targets of the previous night, but they had made a fatal mistake. They chose to take refuge in the barn, where I kept my tanning materials. At 10 o'clock at night, I slipped through the shadows toward the barn. The structure was immense, built to store hay and agricultural equipment, with a ventilation system I knew better than any living man. After all, I had helped design that system 3 years before. Through the cracks in the wood, I could see the 8 men gathered in the center of the barn. Silas was in the middle, a shotgun resting on his lap, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Around him, the remaining overseers, Patterson, Cole, Mitchell, Barnes, Foster, Wright, and young Stevens, maintained nervous vigil. "Has anyone seen anything?" Silas asked for the 10th time in an hour. "Nothing," replied Patterson, a corpulent man with fight scars on his hands. "But I swear I feel like we're being watched." "It's just paranoia," Mitchell muttered, but his voice trembled. "Whoever did that last night won't try again. Not with all of us together." How wrong they were. I had positioned myself in the barn's loft, accessible through an external ladder the guards couldn't see from their position. From there, I had a perfect view of the ventilation system, a series of wooden ducts that circulated air throughout the barn. My plan was simple in its genius. Instead of trying to hit each man individually, I would use the ventilation system itself against them. Finely pulverized quicklime could be dispersed through the ducts, creating a chemical mist that would hit everyone simultaneously. I carefully opened my last quicklime pouch. The powder was so fine it looked like white smoke, almost ethereal in the moon's weak light. I calculated I would need approximately 2 pounds to create an effective concentration in the barn's closed space. The ventilation system worked through natural convection. Hot air rose through ceiling openings, creating a current that pulled fresh air through side entrances. All I needed to do was introduce my modification at the right point in the system. I crawled silently to the main ventilation opening, a wooden grate located directly above where the men were gathered. Through the slats, I could see Silas nervously cleaning his shotgun, his movements revealing an anxiety I had never seen in him before. "Maybe we should have brought some slaves to stand guard," suggested Cole, a thin man with rat eyes. "And trust them." Silas laughed bitterly. "One of them is responsible for this. I'm sure of it." "Do you really think it was Elijah?" asked Stevens, the youngest of the group. "I mean, he's just a tannery slave." "Just a slave?" Silas turned to him, his eyes gleaming with cold rage. "That just a slave knows more about chemistry than any white man in this county. And he has motive. Motive. The word echoed in my mind like a funeral bell. Yes, I had motive. Motive enough to transform that barn into a death chamber. I began pouring the quicklime through the ventilation grate. The powder fell like silent snow, invisible in the barn's darkness. The natural air current dispersed it evenly, creating an almost imperceptible mist that began to accumulate in the air. The reaction wasn't immediate. Quicklime needed to contact moisture to become truly dangerous, and the barn's air was relatively dry, but I knew it would take just a small amount of moisture, sweat, tears, even the men's breath, to activate the chemical process. "It's getting hot in here," murmured Barnes, wiping his sweaty forehead. "It's just nerves," replied Wright, but he was also starting to sweat. "Perfect." The sweat would be the catalyst I needed. I continued pouring the powder, watching as the invisible mist spread through the barn. The men still hadn't noticed anything, but I could see small signs, eyes beginning to water, breathing becoming slightly more difficult. It was Stevens who noticed first. "My eyes are burning," he said, rubbing them with the back of his hand. "Mine too," Cole agreed, blinking rapidly. Silas stood up abruptly, his shotgun in hand. "Something's wrong. Get out. Get out now." But it was already too late. The quicklime had mixed with the men's sweat and tears, creating calcium hydroxide directly in contact with their eyes. The chemical reaction began instantly, burning their corneas with terrible efficiency. What followed was indescribable chaos. Patterson was the first to scream, his hands flying to his face as pain hit him like lightning. Cole stumbled and fell, knocking over a pile of tools that echoed through the barn like thunder. Mitchell ran blindly toward the wall, hitting it hard enough to crack the wood. But it was Silas who gave me the greatest satisfaction. The man who had destroyed my son now stumbled through the barn like a wounded animal, his shotgun firing randomly as he screamed in pain and rage. "Where are you?" he roared, his voice echoing through the ceiling beams. "I know you're there. Show your face, coward." I could have answered, could have revealed my position and faced Silas man to man, but this wasn't about courage or honor. It was about justice. It was about making him feel exactly what my son had felt. One by one, the 8 men succumbed to chemical agony. Their screams echoed through the night, waking the entire plantation, but no one dared approach the barn. Fear had spread like a plague, paralyzing even the slaves who might have helped me. When the last scream turned to moan, when the last man fell to the barn floor, I knew my revenge was almost complete. 19 overseers had laughed while my son screamed in pain. 19 men now knew that same pain, but as I watched the chaos I had created, a cold realization took hold of me. There was no going back. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When the sun rose, they would know it was me. And then would come the final hunt. I silently descended from the loft and moved away from the barn, leaving behind the moans of agony from the men who had destroyed my family. My revenge was complete, but my story was far from over. The last night at Oak Ridge would be the most terrible of all. Have you ever faced the moment when you know there's no turning back, when every choice leads only to destruction? Dawn brought the inevitable revelation. They knew it was me. If you want to discover how a man with nothing to lose can transform his own death into a terrible work of art, keep watching. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, do you believe there's justice beyond the law? The sun rose over a plantation in complete chaos. 19 blind men, moans of agony echoing through the lodgings, and a deadly silence coming from the big house. I was sitting beside Samuel, watching my son sleep restlessly, when I heard footsteps approaching the slave quarters. Master Whitmore appeared at the door, flanked by 2 men I didn't recognize, probably sheriffs from neighboring counties. Their faces were pale but determined. Behind them, Dr. Pemberton carried his black bag, his eyes avoiding mine. Elijah. Whitmore's voice was different. There was no longer the usual arrogance, just deep fatigue. I need you to come with me. I kissed Samuel's forehead and stood slowly. Yes, sir. They escorted me to the big house where a surreal scene awaited me. Silas Cobb sat in a chair on the porch, bandages covering his eyes, his hands trembling as he held a coffee cup he couldn't drink without spilling. It's him, Silas said when he heard my footsteps. His voice was broken, stripped of all the authority that had once made grown men tremble. I can smell the lime on him, that chemical stench that never washes off. One of the sheriffs, a tall man with graying hair, stepped forward. Elijah, you're under arrest for the assault and maiming of 19 men. Do you understand the charges? I looked at Silas, at his bandaged face, at the way his hands shook with rage and pain. I understand, sir. Why? Whitmore's voice cracked. Why did you do this? I treated you well. I never sold your family. You let him blind my son. I interrupted, my voice steady as stone. So you sat there and watched while he destroyed a 12-year-old boy for spilling bourbon, and you worried about your Persian rug. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Take him to the tanning shed, Silas said, rising unsteadily from his chair. I want to talk to him privately. Silas, Dr. Pemberton protested. You can barely stand. Let the law handle this. The law? Silas laughed, but it was a broken sound. The law doesn't understand what this animal has done. He's turned 19 good men into helpless cripples. He's destroyed lives, families, futures. Like you destroyed my son's future? I asked quietly. Silas's face contorted with rage. Your son was property. My men were human beings, were they? I met his blind gaze steadily. Because they laughed while a child screamed. They held me back while you tortured an innocent boy. What kind of human beings do that? The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Perhaps we should take him directly to town. No. Silas's voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. I want answers. I want to know how he did it, and I want him to understand what he's cost us all. They marched me to the tanning shed, the place where I had spent 15 years of my life learning the secrets of chemistry that would become my weapons. The irony wasn't lost on me. I would end where I began. The shed was exactly as I had left it. Vats of chemicals, bags of quicklime, the tools of a trade that had enslaved me and then freed me in the most terrible way possible. Silas stumbled inside, guided by one of the sheriffs, his bandaged face turning toward the familiar smells. 15 years, he said, his voice echoing in the wooden structure. 15 years you worked here, learning, planning. How long have you been thinking about this? Since the moment you blinded my son, I replied honestly. And you used our own materials against us? The quicklime we trusted you with. He moved closer, his hands extended like a blind man learning to navigate. Clever. Diabolical, but clever. It was justice. Justice? Silas's voice rose to a roar. You call this justice? 19 men who will never see their children's faces again? Men who will never work, never provide for their families? You've condemned them to lives of darkness and dependency, like you condemned my son. Your son was one boy, one slave boy. These are 19 productive members of society. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Even now, even blind and broken, Silas couldn't see the fundamental truth. To him, Samuel would always be less than human. The overseers would always matter more than the slaves they brutalized. You still don't understand, I said quietly. You never will. Understand what? That every person you've whipped, every child you've terrorized, every family you've torn apart, they all mattered. They were all human beings with hopes and dreams and love for their children, but you never saw that. You only saw property. Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer but somehow more dangerous. "You're right," he said. "I never saw you as human, and after what you've done, I never will. You're an animal, a rabid dog that needs to be put down." He turned toward the sheriff. "Leave us alone." "Sir, I don't think—" "Leave us alone," Silas roared. "This is my plantation, my property, my jurisdiction. I want 5 minutes with this animal before you take him to hang." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes, no more. They left us alone in the shed, surrounded by the chemicals that had made my revenge possible. Silas stood in the center of the space, his head tilted as he listened to my breathing, trying to locate me in his world of darkness. "You know what's going to happen to you," he said conversationally. "They're going to hang you, slowly. And before they do, they're going to make you watch while they sell your son to the worst plantation in Georgia, a place where blind slaves are worked until they die." My blood turned to ice. "Samuel had nothing to do with this, didn't he?" Silas smiled, and it was the most terrible expression I had ever seen. "He was the catalyst, the reason. Without him, none of this would have happened. So he's as guilty as you are. He's just a child. He's the son of a murderer, and he'll pay for your sins." Something snapped inside me. Not rage. I was beyond rage. It was something colder, more final. A decision that crystallized like quicklime meeting water. I looked around the shed, at the barrels of chemicals, at the bags of lime, at the wooden structure that had been my prison for 15 years. And I smiled. "You're right about one thing, Silas," I said, moving toward the largest barrel of quicklime. "This is going to end today." "What are you doing?" I began opening barrels, mixing chemicals in combinations I had never tried before. Quicklime and sulfur, potash and charcoal, the ingredients for something far more destructive than anything I had used before. "Elijah, what are you doing?" "I'm making sure," I said, striking a match from the box I kept for lighting the furnace, "that you never hurt another child again." The match fell into the chemical mixture, and the world exploded into fire and light. Have you ever wondered what true freedom costs? Sometimes it demands everything, your life, your future, even your soul. But in that final moment, when the flames rose around us like the fires of judgment, I finally understood what it meant to be truly free. If you want to know how a slave's final act became a legend that would echo through generations, keep watching, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what would you sacrifice for justice? The explosion shook the entire plantation. Windows shattered in the big house, horses reared in terror, and every soul at Oak Ridge felt the earth tremble beneath their feet. But inside the tanning shed, time seemed suspended in a moment of perfect, terrible clarity. The chemical fire I had ignited was unlike anything nature ever intended. Quicklime mixed with sulfur created a heat so intense it turned sand to glass. The wooden walls of the shed began to char and crack within seconds, but the real inferno was just beginning. Silas stumbled backward, his blind eyes wide with terror as he felt the heat wash over him. "What have you done? What have you done?" "What I should have done 15 years ago," I replied, watching the flames dance across the ceiling beams. "I've set us both free." The fire spread with supernatural speed, fed by 15 years' worth of accumulated chemicals. Barrels of tanning solution exploded like cannons, sending geysers of flame toward the roof. The air itself seemed to burn, thick with toxic smoke that would have killed us both within minutes if the heat didn't claim us first. But I felt no fear. For the first time in my life, I felt completely at peace. "You're insane!" Silas screamed, crawling toward where he thought the door might be. "We'll both die." "Yes," I said simply, "we will." I could hear voices outside, the sheriff shouting orders, slaves crying out in terror, the sound of buckets being filled with water that would prove utterly useless against this chemical inferno. But none of it mattered anymore. This was between Silas and me, between the master and the slave, between the man who had destroyed my son and the father who would have his justice. "Please," Silas begged, his voice breaking, "I have children. I have a family. So did I." The roof began to collapse, sending burning timbers crashing down around us. One beam missed Silas by inches, and I could see him realize that his blindness, the very condition he had inflicted on 19 men, would be his death sentence. He couldn't see the falling debris, couldn't navigate the maze of fire that surrounded us. "Help me," he whispered. "Please, Elijah, help me get out." I looked at this man who had terrorized slaves for decades, who had blinded my son for spilling bourbon, who had threatened to sell Samuel to a death plantation, and I felt nothing. No hatred, no satisfaction, no mercy, just a cold, final justice. "You want help?" I asked, moving closer to him through the flames. "I'll help you understand something." I grabbed his arm, not to guide him to safety, but to hold him in place as the fire closed around us. "Every slave you whipped felt this helpless," I said, my voice calm despite the roaring flames. "Every child you terrorized knew this fear. Every family you destroyed experienced this despair. Now you know what it feels like to be powerless." "I'm sorry," he screamed. "I'm sorry about your son. I'm sorry about everything." "No," I said quietly. "You're not sorry. You're just afraid. There's a difference." The walls were collapsing now, the entire structure becoming a furnace that would leave nothing but ash and memory. Through the flames, I could see the silhouettes of people gathered outside, too far away to help, too close to ignore what was happening. I thought of Samuel, sleeping peacefully in the slave quarters, unaware that his father was about to become a legend. I thought of all the slaves who would hear this story, who would know that sometimes, just sometimes, justice could be found even in the darkest places. "They'll remember this," I told Silas, as the fire consumed everything around us. "Every plantation in Georgia will hear about the slave who brought down 19 overseers with nothing but chemistry and determination. They'll remember that we're not property, we're people, and people fight back." Silas was sobbing now, the sound barely audible over the roar of the flames. "It doesn't have to end like this. We could both survive, we could—" "No," I interrupted. "This is exactly how it has to end. You in darkness, me in fire, and both of us finally equal." The last thing I saw before the flames took my vision was the roof collapsing completely, bringing down tons of burning wood and metal. The last thing I heard was Silas screaming my name, not in anger, but in a desperate plea for the mercy he had never shown others. And then there was only fire and heat and the strange peace that comes with knowing your purpose has been fulfilled. They found our bodies 3 days later, when the chemical fire finally burned itself out. Silas and I were discovered in the center of the shed, our remains so intertwined by the heat that they couldn't separate us for burial. The irony was perfect. Master and slave, united in death as they never could be in life. The story spread like wildfire through the slave quarters of every plantation in Georgia. The tale of Elijah, the tannery slave who used chemistry to blind 19 overseers and died taking their leader with him. Some called it murder, others called it justice, but everyone called it unforgettable. Samuel grew up hearing that story, learning to navigate his darkness with a pride that no overseer could ever take away. He knew his father had died not as a slave, but as a free man who chose his own ending. And in the ashes of that tanning shed, something new was born. Not just the memory of one man's revenge, but the understanding that knowledge could be power, that the oppressed could fight back, and that sometimes the only way to find freedom was to burn down the world that enslaved you. The plantation owners tried to suppress the story, but you can't kill an idea with whips and chains. The legend of the slave who turned chemistry into justice lived on, whispered in quarters and fields, passed down through generations like a promise. That sometimes, even in the darkest night, a single match can light the way to freedom.